Welcome to our stream of Bhakti discussion on the Bhagavatam, happening weekly. We're going deep into the yoga philosophy here. And as Vrinda and I, Vrinda's back as our guest this week, we were just discussing before how some of the amazing concepts that are in the Bhagavatam, but it all gets tied back to the yoga system. So these are, this philosophy of Bhakti is very deep, very profound, very personal. And it's really elaborately described in this amazing book called the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is the book that we've been gradually going through. We started, I believe it was last September. I think it was last September or so that we started. And now we're on chapter 9 of the first book, or the first canto. And we've been talking about this personality named Bhishma Dev, who was a great warrior. We didn't really discuss much about what happened on the battlefield, other than the fact that he didn't make it. You know, he was shot down in battle. And another detail we didn't mention is that it was Arjuna who shot those arrows that took him off the chariot. And Arjuna shot so many arrows. And this was very difficult because it was his grandfather, right? This whole thing with the Bhagavad Gita, when we open up at the beginning, and Krishna rides out to the, Arjuna says to Krishna, "Please take my chariot so I can see who's assembled on the battlefield." And then he sees all of the warriors standing there. And then Arjuna has this excuse me, he has this breakdown, right? He's got this, crisis where he sees his grandfather, and he sees all of his relatives, his gurus, his teachers, and he puts down his bow. And he's like, "I can't do this. I can't go through this battle." And so Krishna speaks the Bhagavad Gita. So this is after the Bhagavad Gita, where we're in now. The Bhagavatam picks up after the Bhagavad Gita, after the battlefield of Kurukshetra. And these terrible events have taken place where Arjuna, in a dramatic battle, fought his grandfather, and Bhishma Devi fell off his chariot filled with arrows. And he had so many arrows protruding from his body that when he fell from his chariot and he hit the ground, his body didn't actually hit the ground. He was suspended by the arrows that were coming out of the back of his body, which is, I don't know, it's pretty intense imagery there, right? What did you think when you first read that, Vrinda?
Well, I don't know that the first time I read it, I kind of grasped that aspect of it, but then later it was kind of like, wow, this is a lot of arrows. I think, yeah, like he must have been almost like machine gunning out those arrows. Arjuna must have been. And the other thing the thing that struck me the most at that point, I think, was the extent, the effort that Bhishma Dev had gone to antagonize Arjuna to do that.
Yeah, it was difficult all for both. So can you explain that antagonist? We'll go into it a little bit. We'll go into the storyline a little bit.
Oh, gee. Well, I'm not sure I remember all the details, but it involves some, like, Bhishma Dev was known for making pretty intense vows. And he had made one big lifetime choice way long before that got him a nickname that was something about, maker of extreme vows. And then also...
Yeah, you know what that was? That vow that he made was that he would be celibate for the rest of his life. Yeah. And it was such a powerful, difficult vow that flowers fell from the sky, and this voice boomed out. He will be known as, was it Bhishma?
Yeah,
at that time, or
Devavrata or something. What was the nickname? He was the name.
I can't remember the name that was given at that time, but
yeah. It was some meaning.
Celibacy is no joke. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Right. Yes. And he was even asked by, he was later asked, "Hey, you need to let that go because we need you to foster, create some children here." And he was like, "Nope, I can't."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I made a vow. But that during these days of warfare of the Kurukshetra, he made a couple of extra vows. I think because he was actually criticized as potentially going easy on his relatives, and he's like, "Oh, nope." Yeah,
He didn't want to fight Arjuna.
yeah.
And Alex is saying that the Bhishma was the name that actually came from that vow.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
There's also a name that has Vrata in it, because Vrata is
Devavrata. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And he kind of said, basically, I think it was to Duryodhan, "I'll show you." Yeah. And then there was also, Krishna had made a vow that if he was, whichever side he was going to be on, because he was related to all of them, he wouldn't actually use his power. He wouldn't fight as such. He would just be the driver. He'd be the charioteer. And so Bhishma Dev was determined to make him break that vow. And so I think, if I remember correctly, one of the ways he made him break that vow was by really attacking Arjuna.
Mm-hmm.
And then Krishna was like, "Oh, no, you don't." But he didn't take up a weapon. He whipped off the wheel of the chariot. Going to launch that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then just as he was about to fire that throw it or whatever at Bhishma, the sun set, right?
Yeah.
And there was an etiquette at that time amongst warriors that they only fought during the day. And it was when the sun set, the battle would instantly cease. There was some civilized warfare. The warriors would go out to a remote place where civilians and innocent people wouldn't be there, and there would be laws that would govern the righteousness of their battle.
Yeah. It was interesting that in a way it was a sport. In a way,
Yeah.
it was, they were enjoying it. This was something that they lived for, was to have the opportunity to show their skill in real time, in a real activity, and see who could do what. And it was, all this heroic attributes would be displayed. And of course, for them, their strong understanding was that this was not the end of their existence as a spirit soul. So they actually expected a better place to be if dying gloriously on the battlefield. So it wasn't like they thought they were done.
Right.
They thought that heroically displaying their bravery on the battlefield would be a gate, a door to an even better existence.
Living out their nature to the fullest.
Yeah. So they really went for it.
Yeah. In this case, there was some emotional difficulty because, of course, the relationship of love between Bhishma Dev and Arjuna, and how unfortunately they ended up on opposite sides of the battle. And this, of course, as I mentioned, was one of the reasons why Arjuna didn't want to go into battle in the first place, and why Krishna spoke the Bhagavad Gita. And so here we are at the end, when all of this has transpired. The worst possible scenario that Arjuna could have imagined transpired, where he had to take out his grandfather in that way. And now the battle's over, and they're going to see him on the battlefield. It turns out that he was a great mystic yogi that had the ability to keep his life force within his body as long as he wanted to. And he didn't desire to leave his body when he fell from his chariot in battle. He desired to wait until an appropriate time, which is described in the 8th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, for mystic yogis, when they would leave their body when according to where the sun was positioned, how the sun was moving. Like, it's described in the 8th chapter. In fact, one of the verses we'll read today, the Prabhupada comments, and he leans into the 8th chapter of Bhagavad Gita to elaborate. But so now we're at the point where Bhishma has just left some instructions. We talked about that last week, about life, especially for kings, guiding people and comforting Yudhisthira, who is now the victor of the whole battle and is now going on to be the king. And he took some instructions from Bhishma on how to carry out his occupation as a king. But in the course of that discussion, Bhishma noticed that astrologically, things had moved into place where he could now leave his body, as we say. And so he decided in that moment, with Arjuna and Yudhisthira and Krishna and others present, to leave his body. It was time. And so that's where we're at now. Text number 29. Shall we dig into it? That was a pretty decent setting the scene, wasn't it? Yeah, we got like general picture. Text number 29. While Bhishma Dev was describing occupational duties, the sun's course ran into the northern hemisphere. This period is desired by mystics who die at their will. Text 30. Thereupon, excuse me, there's an interesting point here. Like, these next couple of verses, they're really tied to the yoga, to the process of yoga. I think that sometimes we forget that the ultimate goal of yoga is not to have a perfect body or a perfect mind, but it's actually to leave the body and the mind in a perfect way. Leave it behind. So all of the yoga that we do is ultimately meant to separate us from the idea that we're a body, that we're like, that I'm a material body. I'm actually a spiritual being. And so the yogis, when perfecting that through the yoga system, they didn't die at some unknown date. They had the power to choose when they would remove their life force from their body. And it's a pretty powerful thing about yoga. Text number 30. Thereupon, Bhishma, who spoke on different subjects with thousands of meanings, and who fought on thousands of battlefields and protected thousands of men, stopped speaking, and, being completely freed from all bondage, withdrew his mind from everything else and fixed his wide open eyes upon Krishna, who stood before him, four-handed, dressed in yellow garments that glittered and shined. Okay, there's some stuff to unpack here in this in this text. What are your thoughts, Vrinda? Where do you want to start with this?
Interesting. Well, I'm kind of taken with the thought of, it's a deathbed. Mm-hmm. And it's a person who had lots and lots of knowledge on all kinds of topics. And I don't know, I'm kind of leaning toward the thing of it being, well, I'm just remembering so many self-help authors and whatnot who, especially I'm remembering Stephen Covey, Begin with the End in Mind, who even recommend a little exercise to determine what your purpose in life is, to imagine that you are at your last moments and thinking back over your life and what's important to you and what will you be happy having accomplished in your life. So if you can think back, if you can imagine the end of this particular lifetime, and thinking that they say sometimes your life flashes before your eyes, especially if it's a traumatic accidental death or something like that, or just you're there and leaving, and what are you going to be proud of having done? And it's very interesting here that this verse brings up all the many things that were accomplished by Bhishma, and then says, but he stopped speaking, and there was something else, that he withdrew his mind from all those other things, and he actually had a different goal in mind. He wasn't really going like, yep, thousands of battlefields, that was great, I did well, I can,
Right.
he was actually like, it was a relationship that actually he was most confident of, thinking about at this time. And it was, he withdrew his mind from everything else, which means he fixed his mind on one thing. And that was, this person, Krishna, that was standing there at the time. And so to me, that's kind of the interesting thing of a deathbed scene. And what he thought was super important at that time was ultimately a relationship.
I like how you brought out this point about the first part of what you were saying about how he isn't sitting there thinking about all his battles. And I never thought about it this way, but like the point that I've heard of that exercise too, like think about what my last moments would be like, or what I would be thinking at that time, or what would be important, and live my life now as if it was like that was the situation, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. And so I would think that if I did do that, and I lived and I accomplished the things I wanted to accomplish in my life, and then I'd have some kind of contentment at the end, thinking, okay, well, I accomplished so many things that I tried to in this lifetime. And certainly if anybody could have done that, it was Bhishma. But he doesn't do that. And I find it really interesting too, to just see somebody in their last moments and doing something quite transcendental with their mind. And rather than thinking about all of his accomplishments in his life, rather what he's doing is he's withdrawing his mind. And this is really this is a really important aspect of yoga. Like when we think about the yoga process, the whole yoga process, which starts with yama niyama, the kind of what we should be doing or not be doing in terms of a yoga lifestyle, the asana, the bodily postures that one pride. I mean, I'm talking about mystic yoga, right? Or Ashtanga yoga, and then the pranayama, pratyahara, and then it keeps on going. But that process of yoga is a gradual withdrawal of the senses from and the mind from the world, like all the way to samadhi, where one is not at all really involved with the world in a direct way anymore. So yoga really means to withdraw the senses. But when we withdraw the senses, what do we do with them? When we withdraw our mind, what do we do with it? Like we're giving up the bodily concept that we're not a material body. We're giving up the concept that these senses are meant for enjoying the world. And so what do we do with them then? Does this make sense what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, so here at the end, he's a yogi who's kind of in the state of perfection. So he's able to renounce everything and just unplug from the material reality and just focus on his spiritual object of meditation. But it may not be so easy for us to do that right now. Like we may not be so spiritually developed that we can just stop our sense activity, right? And stop, our mind from thinking about everything that's going on in the world. But ultimately, that's one of the goals of yoga is to stop identifying so strongly with the world, with the worldly reality, and to try to focus more on the spiritual reality. And so he's doing this, but how do you get there? That's my question.
Oh, you're asking a question.
Yeah.
Oh, well, it's very interesting. Like I was one of the words that I think of a lot in terms of being in the body is like how laminated we are into the body. Like laminating being a process of gluing where you can't really any longer separate the two things that have been like glue lam beams in construction. And if you take a piece of paper to Staples and ask them to laminate it, it plasticized, and you no longer can separate it into plastic and paper. And how like I was thinking of this particularly a lot as my father was ill and leaving his body, is how how actually kind of scary it can become as you think that you are, as the body breaks down, as the body stops working, and you no longer can do things with it. Like that actually starts several decades before leaving. I can tell you that. Even like being middle-aged is like from there on it's kind of downhill in terms of the body being able to do things it used to be able to do. But that we're not anymore able to count on the body, but we're still laminated to it. We're still stuck with it. And but what we do have is our will. Like we may not even be able to count on our thinking process all that much. Things may happen on that level as well, but we have our will and we can decide what to do with it. And so I'm just thinking about how Bhishma Dev here, he withdrew his mind because he'd had obviously some practice focusing, right? He could count on where he focused. As a great warrior, like the ability to aim at something and hit it, like that takes focus, right? And the ability to keep yourself standing on a battlefield while life-threatening things are being thrown at you, like that. There's some control, like iron will, so his will, and the will is like under your control regardless, but with more practice. Like anything gets better with practice, right? Like if you even something like maybe holding a yoga pose that at first you think you can't hold it for that long, and then I'm thinking of a plank, maybe, those kind of things. Like gradually you work up to it. You gradually, or I don't know, tree pose, you gradually figure out that you can do a little longer than you did before, and you can do a little more than you did before. And so you work at it until mostly for your own believing in yourself that you can is why you work at it. Because there's all kinds of situations where people have used their iron will with stuff that they have not previously practiced with, just because it was really, really important to them. You hear of things like people lifting a car off a wounded child or something like that. They just it's that important that they just are able to will it in the emergency. But if you want to be able to trust yourself on something, then maybe you want to be able to prove to yourself that you can do it by practicing it. I'm going to go back to Stephen Covey a little bit again, where there's the idea of emotional bank accounts, and even your own your bank account with yourself, right? Where you can shortchange yourself, or you can be, start trusting yourself because you've seen yourself keep your promises to yourself. So, to some extent, it's about keeping your promises to yourself. And, some yoga practices and some meditation practices help with that. Because if we decide that, today I'm going to chant X number of mantras on a mala, and we do it. Or today we're going to eat sattvic food only, and we do it. Or today we're going to have nice regulated rest and go to bed at sunset, and we do it. That gradually develops not only, I don't know if you want to say it develops our will, because maybe the will's always there, as we see on the emergency, but it develops our trust in our ability to redirect our will, to take the direction that we want to take, believe that we can. I don't know, is that of any interest?
Yeah. I really the part where you were talking about how Bhishma Dev, he would have had to have such focus to, just to fire an arrow and hit a target, right? What to speak of having a bunch of arrows fired at you, and like you're saying, takes his iron will, and certainly he must have practiced and got to a point where he could trust himself, according to like what everything you just described. So, a lifetime of this made him the most proficient, powerful warrior. And and you can see how it all manifested out of his will to manifest those things. And then on top of that, there's something else that's being revealed about him now, which is that he had another will or another focus going on that must have required a certain amount of absorption and focus throughout his life, which is the transcendental relationship he established with the divine, so that in his last moments, despite the difficulty that he's in, he has the will to put his mind there. So, I mean, as you were describing these things, what I was thinking is that spiritual life, of course, will also require practice. And that practice means this idea of like withdrawing the senses, withdrawing the mind from the material realm, so that when we're there in our last moments of our life and we're about to leave the material situation of our body, then what we can do now to practice for that moment is to practice relating, or is to practice focusing even now on that spiritual reality. Like if we expect to, as yogis, in our last breaths, project ourselves toward a spiritual reality without having tried to see the world in that way during our life, it may be a difficult task, right? Was that all kind of like, do you find that was all in connecting with what you were saying?
Mhm.
Like that? Yeah. So how do we practice then? I find this a fascinating aspect, because for me, this is where Bhakti makes a difference. I mean, there's many places where Bhakti makes a difference, but in terms of its role in the as a yoga practice, how do we target the spiritual nature in Bhakti? Yeah. And that makes all the difference. Like Bhishma, as a warrior, he's going to target he's got his targets and he's got his practices. Our target, or I don't mean to say, I mean our in terms of the Bhakti tradition. Those who practice Bhakti, the target is, as you mentioned, as you started to unpack this verse, that clearly Bhishma has targeted his spiritual intention towards a relationship with the divine. And it seems to be quite personal. And now he is going all in on that in his last breath. He's just focusing on this divine relationship. So it can be assumed then, it's not really spoken about here, that this is a relationship that he was cultivating throughout his life, not just suddenly in this moment. Any thoughts on all that?
I'm sure he didn't just, this was not just a thought in this moment, because the little that I know about this amazing history of, the Mahabharata and everything, is that all of these individuals were well known to each other and related to each other through marriage and involved in many incidents previously with that led up to this battle. And and Krishna was very, very much appreciated by the good guys in the story, and to some extent not very much appreciated by the bad guys in the story. And it was definitely a situation of relationship where, I mean, Arjuna's, the only reason that Bhishma, it was all about relationship. Bhishma was on Duryodhana's side because of past relationship. Krishna's army was on Duryodhana's side because Krishna offered himself to both cousins. It said, one of you can have me and the other one can have my armies. What do you want? And they both immediately knew what they wanted. And Arjuna wanted his friend Krishna. And the Duryodhana was like, oh, good, I'll take the armies.
This is
the armies first.
Yeah, this is the interesting point, and this is something that's going to come out in this chapter, is that as we've spoken about many times in our study of the Bhagavatam, in yoga there are different conceptions of divinity, and one of them is described as the Brahman, the spiritual energy that permeates everything, and a yogi comes to understand that there is a divine energy that animates the world, and that everything has a divine source, and we're all kind of connected through that source. Sometimes that Brahman is described as kind of a light that yogis strive to attain. And then there is a more kind of concentrated form of that that Brahman in a more concentrated form, or the source of the Brahman, you could say, is more personal and located in everyone's heart. That everybody has, this Paramatma, this supreme consciousness residing in each of our hearts, and it's a voice within that's always guiding us. And yoga is one path of yoga, and in fact, Ashtanga yoga ultimately is meant to the journey inward to find the source of that inner voice, and to meet the super soul, to come in to realize the divinity that has always been present within our heart, guiding us. And then there is the Bhagavan, who is the personification, like Krishna being the source of both the super soul and the light, the being both the source of that guidance in the heart and kind of the effulgence that the yogi strives for. So maybe an analogy to help break this down a bit. Like, you got one, Vrinda?
Oh, well, I'm partial to the one about as you are traveling towards, a geographic feature such as a mountain.
Mm-hmm.
At first, you can see the outline of the mountain. You can be aware there is a mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And that is in some way like you're very aware that there's a spiritual reality to the world. You're very aware that there is something that is something that is permanent in the along with all these things that are temporary, and something that is solid and special. And so there's a mountain there. As you get closer to the mountain, you become aware that there is some features to the mountain, not just the outline. And so then you kind of are aware that, okay, there's, there seems to be, a valley over here, and there's a forest on it over there. And so you become to know a little bit more intimately what the mountain is made of, and what the mountain actually looks like, more than just an outline. And this is to some extent comparable to understanding that there is the Paramatma feature, where it is actually there is a spiritual reality that is actually in you as well. And then there's the idea that as you actually get onto the mountain, you are aware that the trees are alive, and that there's life going on, and there's all kinds of things happening on the mountain. It's got a reality of its own, totally separate from, or not necessarily separate in the sense that it is unrelated to you, but there's a reality that it has life and busyness and activity, and you can be a part of that, but whether you are or not, it's happening there. There's stuff happening there. And so that's the sort of analogies never work perfectly, but to some extent an analogy of the Bhagavan feature of there's richness and amazing stuff there, more than you were aware of when you saw the outline of the mountain. But it's still the same mountain.
Mm-hmm. And the Bhagavan feature being like a personality behind the the source of the others, just like the mountain itself is the source of the silhouette.
Mm-hmm.
It's the source of the valleys and the trees that you see at a distance, and it's also the source of the life that lives there when you enter the mountain. In the same way, Bhakti sees that there's actually personality, personal energy behind behind all the energy, and from that emanate the divinity that exists within our hearts, and the divinity that permeates all creation through light. So it's kind of like emanating from that source of a personal source. And the way that the Bhagavatam describes this is sometimes that personal feature of the divine manifests, and in the world, and at that time, that manifestation is called an avatar. And the Bhagavatam is particularly focused on Radha and Krishna. Well, and here we're specifically talking about Krishna being in front of Bhishmadev. So Krishna being actual divinity, and actually an object of meditation for yogis, which is really far out. That's maybe not something that's been so popularized in yoga circles yet, in this day and age in the West. But the fact that a personality behind it all Krishna as an object of meditation, and part of the yoga process. And so Bhishma, having been a great yogi, is now doing that. Now, having practiced becoming aware of that relationship throughout his life, all of that development of the relationship comes forward in his last moments as the most important thing for him to meditate on. Not all the battles, not all the great accomplishments that he did as a minister to the king or a prince himself at one time, but all of everything that he invested in trying to understand his relationship with the divine, in terms of and the personal nature of it, kind of comes to the surface. It percolates to the surface as the most important thing in his last breaths. Yeah. So it's really beautiful, and the rest of this chapter is going to be Bhishma just expressing his mind in this moment to the person that he's been meditating on all along. Krishna, the avatar, is now manifested. And in fact, he's revealing something about himself to Bhishma here that he wasn't revealing before, which is in the second part here where he says, Sri Krishna, who stood before him four-handed, dressed in yellow garments that glittered and shined. It's the first time, I think it's the first time, it's the second time in the Bhagavatam we're hearing Krishna manifest four arms. Yeah. So we won't get into the significance of that at this moment, but it's just that Krishna has different moods, and Krishna's mood when he's manifesting his forearms is quite special, and he's reciprocating with Bhishma in a particular way in his last moments. I don't know, I think we dug into that verse pretty good, didn't we?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the purport or in the commentary here, we won't go into it, but Prabhupada, he brings out, he goes to like 10 verses from the Bhagavad Gita to talk about this, like what a yogi does at the end of the yogi's life. And there's some famous Bhagavad Gita verses here, which we won't dig into today, but like, for example, the first one, whoever at the time of death quits his body, remembering me alone at once attains my nature. Of this there is no doubt. That means that whatever state of being one remembers when one quits the body, that state one will attain without fail. That's like that's a classic, famous verse from Bhagavad Gita, right? So it means that whatever we're thinking about at the end of this life, that's going to propel us into the next situation that we're going to incarnate in. If we need to take birth again in this world, then whatever we're thinking about in our last moments of this life will project us towards that situation in our next life. Or if we have purified our mind and consciousness to such an extent where we're completely absorbed in transcendence, then our soul, like a great yogi, will transcend all of the material reality and enter into the transcendent spiritual reality. So there's beautiful parts of the Bhagavad Gita in chapter 8. I mean, these are just amazing topics, right? I suggest we keep going and stick with Bhishma for now, because these topics do resurface nonetheless. But I mean, I just wanted to, for me, it's just once in a while, I just like to appreciate the depth of topics and what's going on in this literature, especially in the Bhagavad Gita, which is such a famous book. Anything else that you wanted to say about that verse, Vrinda, before we go to the next one?
Are we going to be able to go to the next one today?
I think that we could read it.
Because if so, I'd like to.
Yeah. I think we could read it and see where we go. You're right. We don't have much time. We only got about 10 minutes. So I guess we'll set the scene for next time for the next verse. And fortunately, I was speaking with Vrinda beforehand. Let's see, the strategy here is that now that we're inviting different guests to come and discuss this with us, I'd like to discuss, I'd like to be with somebody like Vrinda as we go through a section. So now we're with Bhishma Dev. I'd like to keep on continuing. I'd like to continue the discussion with Vrinda till we get to the end. But when will the end come? Like how we're not going so quickly, right? And it's hard to go quickly. But so we've at least got you for next week, right? So we can read this next verse and see how far we can get in 10 minutes with it. The next verse is text 31. By pure meditation, looking at Krishna, he at once was freed from all material inauspiciousness and was relieved of all bodily pains caused by the arrow wounds. Thus, all the external activities of his senses at once stopped, and he prayed transcendentally to the controller of all living beings while quitting his material body. This is intense. One thing is that this is just something that jumped out at me, is that all the external activities of his senses at once stopped. But in the next sentence, he's still acting. So it's interesting, right? Like he's pretty much deactivated his material reality, where his body is not, his senses are his external activities are stopped. They're finished. Now he's engaging just his spiritual senses. I think we maybe need to talk about what that means, but what jumped out for you here?
I just relieved of all bodily pains, because for heaven's sake, he was experiencing bodily pains, all those many arrows in him.
Yeah.
And probably they were bleeding profusely, and probably it was pretty painful. But he, it's just very interesting. He actually was relieved of these pains by this pure meditation process.
And you're right. He certainly would have been a lot of pain. And of course, we will get in the sections in the Bhagavatam here where it does describe the process of dying. That does come up in the Bhagavatam in quite detail. And it is described as being quite a painful process. But he was able to get relief and experience no pain. Yeah, that's because of being able to transcend, right? Anything else pop out to you there?
Oh no, I'd like to hear what popped out for you.
Okay. Well, inauspiciousness. By pure meditation, looking at Lord Sri Krishna, looking at Krishna, he at once was freed from all material inauspiciousness. Like what I'm catching in this verse is that at this point in his life, it's, we're watching somebody die in the pages of the Bhagavatam here. And what's catching me is that there's a clear distinction about the reality of him being a material body is clearly separating from the reality of his being a spirit soul. Like for me, it's quite like I don't know. It's quite apparent here how he's giving up this the reality of him being as his body is dying. Like he's not at all disturbed, but he's also continually he's existing nonetheless. His personality, his determination, his will isn't wavering, despite the fact that his body is dying. And he's being freed from all of the inauspiciousness. So when I this word inauspicious, I don't know if that's a What's another word for that?
Good question. Well,
Inauspicious.
auspicious. Inauspicious is the opposite of auspicious. And
What's another word for auspicious?
auspicious is like with good omens, with every possibility of being beneficial for everybody.
Yeah, beneficial. That's a good one. Yeah. So all things that are everything that's materially not beneficial, he's been able to become free from because of his meditation, because of his spiritual realization. He's being separated from all of the things that are not beneficial about being in a material body at the end of life. And that's the difference with a yogi, is that a yogi is able to, at the end of their life, get rid of the unbeneficial things. But if we haven't developed our consciousness in that way, so the risk would be that as the body is disintegrating, we cling to being a body. Now, clearly, there's going to be some unbeneficial things about thinking oneself to be a body at the end of life, because certainly we're going to perceive that the body is coming to an end. So it's going to be like inauspicious or unbeneficial to think, I am this body that is now ending. And what alternative will we have but to think that, unless we have cultivated a spiritual understanding of ourselves, which is not the body, which is the very goal of yoga. And so here is like Bhishma he's like, it's expressing his freedom. He's like, he's free from all this unbeneficial things that can happen at this time of life. Because death is actually a time of life. Death is not actually a time of an end of life. I think that's the big problem with how we look at death. You know, I'm taking this course right now, and because I can't, like when the course is called Death, it's called Aging, Death, and Democracy. That's the name. That's the name of the course, right? So I can't help it that when I have an elective or something, I'm going to take this kind of a course, right? Just to see what it's just going to, I got to go check it out. And, but the concept of death is really about death. It's really about like the end of life. It's really about how reality ceases to be, or if there's even a reality at all. Like it's really like, it's very distant from the concept of yoga and our spiritual self, ourself as a spiritual being. A yogi never sees death as a moment of life ending, and that's a definition that somehow has become incorporated into our understanding of death in our current culture, right? Death, of course, means the end of the body, but it does not mean the end of life. And this is an integral point in yoga. What are your thoughts on this?
Oh, yeah, it's interesting because we even, there are all kinds of things that are labeled end of life care, all those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And and of course, we hide death processes. Like I don't think I saw a dead body until I was well into my teens. And, partly that's a thing about, we had start having smaller families, right? So then maybe 100 years ago, like I think both my grandparents came from families with 12 or 15 kids. And so things happen, one or two of the siblings die as young people. then they also, everybody has 12 or 15 aunties, and some of them start dying and whatnot. My family didn't live close to the previous generations, so we never didn't know about, when those grandparents died in England or something. We didn't know about it much, and so it was very kept separate. And then it was then even when we were in touch with it a little bit, it was highly sanitized. It all moved over to the funeral home, right? And then it came back into the place where the funeral was, maybe closed casket most of the time. Like it was something that was very, very not, it was taboo, a taboo topic, basically. So even more so than in previous generations, it was something that was not prepared for much, because it wasn't even talked about. So the whole idea of what to do during it was just kind of swept under the rug. The whole idea of what goes on was kind of swept under the rug. And of course, the Christian idea was that you either went to heaven or hell. And so you were kind of, buying your fire insurance by going to church and making sure that you maybe went to heaven. I guess that though was that did, and of course the whole breakdown of the Christian philosophy as a guiding factor of the entire population meant that people stopped believing in that and stopped preparing for death by being good in life. If the Santa Claus aspect, somebody's making a list. And I don't want to sound disrespectful of anybody, but I think I just did, and I apologize. But the idea of behaving properly in life so that your next destination would be not awful began to break down, and even that didn't motivate people. And a lot of people really thought then it's done. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you'll die, and it's over. So, enjoy yourself now, because it doesn't really matter. And so the whole attitude of the culture that I grew up in to death was quite different from the idea of, material inauspiciousness is something to be something you need to get free of and help figure out your next destination. It was very interesting, even when George Harrison put out a song, The Art of Dying, right? Nobody had talked about how to die. So it's a big topic that maybe we all need to figure out, since we're all going to have that final exam.
And there we are in this chapter, which is all about that. This is How to Die by Bhishma Dev in the Bhagavatam, right? Like this is what it's all about. Anyway, it's not really like it can be somebody may feel uncomfortable with such a topic, but it's actually quite a liberating topic to be able to acknowledge the eternal aspect of ourselves, and to hear about possible ways that we may be able to tap into that knowledge of ourselves and how to use it so that it's there when we need it, especially at the very end, when it seems so crucial. That it's important that we cultivate a spiritual understanding of ourselves, because the end of this life is an important moment. And we want to be able to take all of that we've been working on, all our spiritual development, and have it with us in the most difficult test of all. Life throws enough at us anyway, right? What to speak of when it's time for the body to go? What kind of test is that, right? It's the ultimate test. Anyway, thank you, Vrinda. I really enjoyed that conversation. That was really, we went into some unanticipated areas there, which I really enjoyed. And the conversation continues. Bhishma is still there. He hasn't gone yet. He's still got some things to say. So next week, if we're happy to know that you're open to come back and continue this discussion next week. Thank you so much for joining us again.